Hello and good evening, or maybe good afternoon, depending on your location or state of mind. Welcome to Writers in Conversation. I am Carole Burns, the Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing at the University of Southampton and the director of our Writers in Conversation reading series. And I'm thrilled tonight that we'll be talking to Carys Davies about her most recent novel, Clear, and many other writerly topics and ideas. So I think Carys's head must be spinning, right? From the accolades she has received for this beautiful novel. Clear has been the winner of the 2025 Wales Book of the Year Award, the Royal Society of Literature's Ondaatje Prize, and just announced last week the 2025, and this is where it's revealed I took Spanish at university, Prix de Meilleure Livre étrangère. Carys can correct me on that, which honors the year's best work of fiction published in France in translation. She's written 2 other novels and 2 short story collections, and her other prizes include the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. We are talking to her tonight from Paris, where she is currently a fellow at the Columbia University Institute for Ideas and the Imagination. And Carys, I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you tonight about this beautiful novel, Clear.
I'm delighted to be here, Carole. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Yes. And it's wonderful we have this online audience. I mean, I miss seeing people in person, but it's great that we can welcome so many other people from possibly across many countries tonight. So that's really nice too. So I wanted to start by asking you about something that I know a little bit about the origin of this novel. And that's also something very close to every writer's heart. And it was a dictionary that first inspired this novel. Can you talk about that book and how all of that came to be?
Yes, of course. I mean, yes, I wrote this book in a way that was completely different from the way I've written any other book, and that was very much to do with the way it came about, which is that back in, I think it was 2010, I was working late one evening in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, where I live, and I was actually working on a different novel, and I was having a very bad day, writing very badly, and I got up to take a break, and I'm very much a creature of habit, and I always sit in the same place in the reading room, which is in the dictionary aisle. I've always loved dictionaries, but and I came across a dictionary in a language which at the time I had never heard of, Norn, which is, and some people might know this, but I didn't at the time. It's the language that used to be spoken on the islands of Orkney and Shetland, but began to die out in the middle of the 15th century when the islands were pawned by the Danish king to Scotland, and it was gradually pushed out by Scots. But all this I discovered later. That afternoon, I just literally opened the dictionary and started reading it. And this is where, I don't know, call it serendipity or coincidence or magic kind of comes into play. But one of the very first words that my eye caught was a word that means to write very badly. So I think from the beginning had the feeling that I was meant to find this dictionary. But what mostly captivated me was just this incredible sort of specificity and beauty of these words, which immediately started to conjure not just a sense of place, but a whole way of life, a kind of feudal existence. I mean, there's a little glossary at the end of the novel, which just, it's just a list of, I don't know, maybe there are 30 words which crop up in the book. But just to give you an example, you know, there's a word that means a dense bluish fog along the shore in calm weather. You know, and it's just one tiny little 5-letter word. So I I knew I'd found something amazing here. I just didn't really know what it was, except that I was just obsessed with this dictionary, and I kept going back to it and reading it and making lists of words over a period of about 10 years, until just very gradually a picture of a man who in my imagination was the last speaker of this language, which I knew was, on its way to dying out. And so what happened was during COVID, I had been writing something else, I think, and then I just began to retreat into the dictionary again, and I would take just a sort of random, I don't know, 10 words or something, and just write a scene with the 10 words, and just very slowly, kind of layer by layer almost, began to be able to see this island and the character of this man, Ivar, moving around. But for a very long time, I still didn't really know what his story was. I just had this sense that he was in some kind of danger, which I think probably had to do with the fact that I knew the language was in danger, and that, I mean, I don't want to preempt. I'm sure you've got other questions which will probably take us into the history and so on, but it led me to a particular moment in Scottish history where this language kind of came together with various other forces, if you like.
Yes. And so you have Ivar, and then you had him in danger. Did you do some research and find out when the language died out and realize that's when the clearances were happening, or did all this just magically work out?
I never do a huge amount of research at the outset. I like to just sort of be as free as I can be and just sort of use what I knew. So what I knew about Norn was that it began to die out really very early. So by the, well, I should probably say that what the dictionary was, what that dictionary is, it's a collection of about 10,000 words that were gathered by a Faroese scholar called Jakob Jakobsen, who knew that this language was dying out. And he traveled to Orkney and Shetland in the late 19th century, by which time Norn was really, really, really dying out. But he went and he talked to all the old people, and he, in many cases, he sort of had to drag the words out of them because they were slightly ashamed, because Norn was the language of the peasants, and they didn't want to be seen as knowing it. So it was not an easy task for him, and he'd use the younger people as sort of go-betweens to drag these words out of them. So it was words that they could remember using as children, which perhaps now in the late 19th century had already basically dropped out of use. So what in my imagination, what I thought, well, okay, well, what if one man had lived in a spot so remote that it was possible that he was still speaking what was essentially, a native tongue around about the middle of the 19th century. So that seemed possible to me if he was in a remote enough spot and hadn't had much contact with other people. So that's really where it began. And then I think growing out of this sense of danger, I had the feeling that it wasn't just the language that was in danger, it was his whole existence, which kind of led me to the Highland clearances, which at that stage were in their sort of most brutal and coercive stage. Just a word about the Highland clearances. This is when, in Scotland, the big landowners in the middle of the 18th century, they began clearing their estates of their smaller, poorer tenants to make way for basically big sort of sheep branches, because sheep were more profitable than than having people on them. And this kind of sheep frontier had been just moving steadily further north. So I imagined, this little sort of rocky island being there and not yet fully exploited. So the story involves a landlord who decides, he's going to put sheep on this island. He needs to get the tenant off. The tenant is Ivar. So he sends somebody to evict Ivar from his home.
And that somebody is an authorial choice as well. It's not your typical person who's going to clear somebody off an island. It's a minister who's impoverished because of leaving his church on ethical grounds, who decides he's desperate for the money. How did that idea come to be?
So again, that sort of grew out of the moment in history, because the other part, you've got the Highland clearances going on, this sort of huge upheaval in Scottish society, rural society. But at the same time, you've got this massive split in the Scottish Presbyterian Church, which takes place in 1843, where about a third of the ministers break away from the established church to form the new Free Church of Scotland. And this is where it kind of gets a little bit complicated, but I'll unpick it. So the reason the rebel ministers leave the main church is because they're against the custom of patronage, whereby the landowners are allowed to appoint ministers to the livings on their estates. And the new free churches believe that that's overstepping their mark. They shouldn't be doing that. But what was interesting to me is that even though you've got this split in the church, and I should mention that the rebel ministers, in breaking away, they give up everything. They give up their homes, they give up their livings, their money. So until the new church raises enough money to pay them a salary effectively and house them, they're kind of on their uppers. So this is why my character, John Ferguson, has no money. He's very worried about money. He's recently got married. And that's why he accepts this rather unusual commission to go and evict Ivar. And what some people, they'll sort of say, but hang on a second, I thought the new free church rebels had broken away because they didn't like the landlords, and it was a dispute with the landlords. But what you have to remember is that if you're a Presbyterian minister in the middle of the 19th century, really doesn't matter if you're with the new church or the established church. You are socially conservative. You respect the landowner's right to do what he wishes with his property. You're not a champion of the poor, so you have to kind of get your head into the 19th century and sort of leave aside your assumptions about what sort of person that new free church minister might be. So it's fair to say John, he is anxious, he is nervous about the commission, but nonetheless, because he's so worried about money, he does accept it.
Yeah. So I think you're going to read a little bit from us where all the characters are, I'm not going to say anything else. You're just going to read a really lovely passage for us.
So it's I'm just going to read a short passage from it's quite near the beginning of the novel, when my Presbyterian minister, John Ferguson, has arrived on the island, but Ivar doesn't know that he's arrived yet, because John Ferguson, the minister, has arrived in the middle of a storm when Ivar's sort of battened down at home. And so John arrives, spends a rather uncomfortable night in the little sort of estate house there, And then in the morning sets off for a little explore, but has a terrible accident. And I won't say too much, but in the course of this accident, he becomes separated from all his belongings. So we're going to join Ivar, who is just going down to the shore to collect some grass for his horse, Peggy. At the inlet, having decided against his breakfast, Ivar worked steadily, bent over and tearing armfuls of the luxuriant grass from between the rocks. Slowly he moved across them, picking the grass as he went, and it was here that he stopped and straightened himself and looked out across the water. During his illness, dark swimming patches had often appeared in his vision, black clots that floated before his eyes if he made the slightest movement, and for a moment he didn't move. There was a word in his language that described the covering and uncovering of a sunken rock by the sea, and it would have also described exactly the way the dark and lumpy object kept sinking beneath the shallow waves and then appearing again. He blinked, and when the dark shape was still there, he dropped the grass and began to wade out. But the wind was blowing now, coming in gusts of increasing violence, and every time he reached for the lumpy mass, it heaved away from him, out of reach. On the foreshore, Peggy stood with her head down, the wind whipping sand against her flanks and into her eyes. Ivar snatched again at the floating object, and this time he caught the edge of it and drew it close. For a long time, he stood on the beach looking out at the departing tide. Mist and fine rain were being driven before the wind. Sweet water trickled from the base of the cliffs behind him. He saw puffins and seals and cormorants, nothing else. For more than an hour he stood there, but there was nothing and no one, no large vessel or small boat of any kind. And in the end he hung the satchel from his shoulder, packed the grass into Peggy's baskets, turned his back on the beach, and went home. In the satchel, he found a bundle of sodden papers inside a blue cloth cover, a comb like the one Hannes had once brought back for Jenny from Bergen, the time he got the tea and the tobacco, only smaller and with smoother teeth. A piece of corn-coloured soap, soft and squashy from all the water. A tin containing a small folding knife and what he believed to be writing implements. And right at the bottom, under the papers, he found a dark-haired woman inside a leather frame, looking up at him from behind a piece of broken glass with a shy and secret smile. So we'll leave him there, I think.
I could just open. I've read this novel, a couple of times, and I talked to a book club about it. I taught it last week. I feel like I could open any page and read a passage, and it's just so beautifully constructed. And that's yet another example of that. So gorgeous. And here we have Mary, who, it's impossible to have a favorite character in this book, right? They're all wonderful. But she seems the most clear-sighted of all the characters. And the one, although she's not the minister, with a real sense of moral justice. Did that happen by happenstance? Did you want somebody to have this clear-eyed vision of the world?
I never set out kind of wanting my characters to be one thing or another, but I have been asked more than once, I have to say, why are you drawn to these kind of slightly mixed up middle-aged men who always seem rather poorly equipped, for the situations that they end up in. And I'm not sure I have a really good answer for that, other than that I am just interested in those sorts of men who are that there are a real mix of qualities. I'm thinking primarily of John here. He's essentially a good man, but he's sort of, he's courageous in many ways. He's broken away from the church, but he's also a bit cowardly. He's a bit frightened of going to the island. He's very anxious. He gets seasick. He's got a terrible sense of direction. So maybe it seemed sort of natural to me that he would be attracted to somebody as sort of sure of herself as Mary is. I mean, so but I should say all three characters, they're all in their 40s, which I think almost by today's standard is more like they're more like in their 50s. They're not young. They're not young people. And Mary never expected or particularly wanted to get married until she met John, and she meets him in rather an unusual way. But they meet and they get together. And I suppose early on, when I wrote this, there's a scene early on where they travel to the estate office where it's explained to John what he's going to have to do. And, I knew that Mary was present, and I could sort of feel her silent rage, I do. I mean, one of my slight bugbears about historical fiction is very often the female characters. I feel they are given more. They're given a very modern sort of degree of agency, and I'm much more interested in women. A woman like Mary in the middle of the 19th century. What kind of agency does she manage to carve out for herself within the very strict limitations? And she she loves John, and she knows he's a good man. So she sort of and she knows that he's sincere. She knows that he's doing this because he's worried about money, because he wants to look after her, put a roof over her head. So she kind of just keeps her worries to herself until she doesn't. That's probably all I say without giving too much away. So I did, although I didn't plan her character, I did have a very clear sense from very early on who she was. And she is a very important force in the novel. And again, without giving too much away.
Absolutely vital.
Yeah.
Absolutely vital to the novel, even though so much of it takes place on an island where she isn't.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And yet she is just a force in the novel, absolutely necessary.
Yes. And she's so she's, when I wrote that scene and Ivar finds the picture, I didn't know that was going to happen until it happened, but it just felt so right that Mary should be present in some in Ivar's imagination, and present there on the island, even though she's still a long way away, back on the mainland.
And then the other interesting, one of the many, many interesting things that happens in the novel is this, how these two men forge a friendship despite not sharing a language, and despite their having opposite desires. Ivar isn't going to want to leave his island, and John's job is to take him off it. And so was that again something that happened as you were writing?
Well, I mean, I definitely knew very early on that was the essential complication, was that here was one man didn't want to leave, another man has come to tell him he has to. What I hadn't sort of really reckoned on was what a tricky spot I'd got myself into with two characters who can't speak to each other. That's quite a challenging situation for a novel, because, well, I'm sure there are some novels where perhaps people don't speak to each other. I don't know, but to me, it seemed impossible that these two should form any kind of relationship if they couldn't communicate. So very slowly, they do begin to communicate in a kind of pidgin way. And so it seemed to me that John, he tells us actually that one of the reasons he joined the church was his sort of love of the language of scripture. You know, he could perhaps have easily been a poet or so, you know. So he's very, very interested in language, and he's actually working on something Mary slightly teasingly calls his great project, which is to translate the Gospels into Scots. Because at that point, amazingly, the Gospels hadn't been translated into Scots, so were only available in English, even though most of John's congregation back on the mainland, that their language would have been Scots, not English. So he's working on this project. So he's naturally very, very interested in language, and very, very gradually, very, very gradually, and obviously in a short time, you know, he can't learn Ivar's language, but he can learn enough of it to understand that there's a different way of looking at this new world that he finds himself in, which is really what happens in that he's sort of taken out of his very educated life, and he's been placed somewhere where he has to evaluate life differently, and to a great extent he uncovers that literally through the words themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that how he learns Norn mimics your learning word by word a tiny bit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't speak Norn, but I had to go through. I mean, in his dictionary, Jakobson, he breaks down every word phonetically, so I had to kind of study the phonetic rendering of each word to give myself an idea of what it would sound like. And there, because John starts to make up his own little dictionary, so he writes everything down. So obviously he's not going to write words down to look like they look in the Norn dictionary, because he's just hearing the words. So I had to sort of be constantly aware of that adjustment. But yeah, and I think in a way he expresses the kind of delight and wonderment that I experienced when I got acquainted with the dictionary and the words.
Well, I'm delighted by the passage you read had this phrase in it, and you'll often say, if he were to use a word in his language, or the word in his language that he thought of. And so I'm going to read out one of my favorite little scriptures of that. He might have reached for that word in his language that described what happens when a rock is covered and uncovered by the sea, when briefly the water rises up and submerges it completely before it falls away again and reveals it. That's just the fact there's a word for that.
Yes,
simply amazing.
Yeah, which I have to admit, I can no longer remember the Norn word, but I do think that matters in a way. And actually, there are a lot of instances in the book where we don't ever learn what the Norn word is, because that was the other quite challenging thing. I was to not overload the story with, with all these words, and I didn't want it to be this sort of and did you know the Inuit have 100 different words for snow? I didn't want it to be that. That wasn't the point of any of this. And really there's much more that the definitions of the words and the words themselves wove the sentences and the paragraphs, and I mean, to give you one example, Ivar's house, I sort of built it out of the words for the weighted ropes that he uses to, keep the thatch down on his house, the square hole in the roof through which the smoke escapes, and the runnel, the sort of drain at the edge in the interior of his house where the waste runs out. All these little things. These are all words that become, concrete visual aspects of his life and what John encounters on the island, and there are lots and lots and lots of different words for different kinds of mud and bog, and so they spend quite a lot of time stomping through muddy bogs and puddles and things, and there are three hills on the island, and this is just because I came across a word for a white hill and a pointed hill and a round hill. These all have their specific words, so they became concrete things on Ivar's island.
Mm-hmm. So at the same time, I want to mention to our audience that we will be moving to questions at some point. So do send them in. Just because I haven't asked you invited any yet doesn't mean that we won't be. So don't be shy. We'd love to get questions from the audience, and we'll be turning to that shortly. And I've distracted myself from my question. Oh, I know. So it's also at the same time, you have to turn the page in this novel. I mean, it is very tense, and you do want to know what happens. Is that something that comes naturally to you, that idea of plot and narrative momentum, or is it something you feel you need to?
It's interesting. I mean, I don't plan and I don't plot, but I am very conscious that it's almost like visualizing a kind of rope that I'm kind of pulling the reader, through. I do feel it's very important to, you read one paragraph, there's something there that makes you want to go on to the next paragraph and the next paragraph, and from one chapter to the other. And it is, I suppose, quite deliberately structured to ratchet up the tension, for sure. I mean, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to sort of say the essential structure after a certain point is that we flip between sort of Mary chapters and Ivar and John chapters. And there's a sort of there's a kind of pincer movement that's going on where, some kind of meeting is inevitable. Well, really the essential, once you've got a complicated situation that is leading you somewhere, John has come to evict Ivar. You're moving towards this sword of Damocles that's kind of hanging over the novel. So it was quite a tense situation from the beginning, just because of that, and then all the complications between the characters sort of ratchet up the tension even further. So yes, once I know what the story is. And by no, what I mean is I don't kind of think it up. Once I've written what's essentially the story, then I do an awful lot of work on sort of thinking, okay, so is that, would it be better to have that scene after that, or, would it be better to delay that, or, and there's a lot of tension to be gained from the point at which you choose to finish one chapter and then leap to the beginning of another chapter and then return, to that moment. So the handling of time becomes very fun, actually, to be dovetailing everything. And so, yeah, I mean, tension is extremely important for me. And I'm always thinking about maintaining the tension. And if I sort of feel the tension is ebbing away a little bit, I sort of go back and think, okay, what can we do to sort of keep that on the boil? So, yeah, I am definitely very conscious of that.
And the way you change point of view, you mentioned the second half, but even the first section is changing between Ivar and John.
Mm-hmm.
And, you change once, and then you realize that the man he needs to evict is Ivar, who we've just met. And immediately we're like, when's this going to happen? When are they going to meet? I mean, so, and then you changed very strategically between those two points of view.
Well, there's so much tension to be had from one character knowing something that another character doesn't, or, and that happens throughout the novel. There's an awful lot of tension to be had in, straightforward dramatic irony, where the reader knows more than the characters.
Yes. And then you have that beautifully, you just kind of float up into this omniscience point of view so effectively and fluidly, and always at the right time. Did you always know you would do that? Or
I think there were just certain moments when it's just, I don't know, I like to do that, sort of suddenly just take a bit of a bird's eye view of everything. And I mean, it's all artifice, isn't it? In real life, we're all inside our own heads. None of us, I don't know what's inside your head. You don't know what's inside mine at any given moment. But it's the magic of fiction is that, that can be kind of laid out on the page, and we can flip between heads, or or the author can hold things back. I mean, I don't like to play tricks, and I really hope I don't hold back information in a false way. I think when characters don't know things, it's because they haven't been told, or they can't know things, but the reader knows. So
I definitely don't think you're doing anything, you're not cheating.
I mean, there is one moment, there's quite a dramatic moment where something happens, and it is written in such a way that we know something has happened, but we don't quite know what it is. I don't know if you know which bit I'm talking about.
I'm not 100% sure. I would guess, but I'm not 100% sure.
It's
at the end.
Towards the end, yes. Yeah.
Yes. I think I do. Yeah.
But, but again, it's only what I'm doing there is I'm just sort of narrating what's happening. And actually pretty soon you do find out. I'm not a big believer in kind of just torturing the reader by withholding information. I think that's a bit of a cheap trick.
Yes, I agree. My students, I've probably told my students that too. they can put a thumbs up in the chat. So my last question until we move to a question from the audience, and then I can always ask questions. So One thing I was wondering, so as well as the plotting being so intricate and well done, I mean, word by word, sentence by sentence, the with this novel and all of your writing, it's so concise and gorgeous. So tell me you don't like start writing at 2 a.m. when you've had a glass of wine and it all comes tumbling out and then it's perfect in the morning. I want to hear you torture yourself with this, but what is your process then for?
It's pretty chaotic. I mean, it takes me a very long time to figure out the first sentence. I will always have written a lot before I sort of arrive, and then gradually, that first sentence will sort of rise to the surface. I mean, and then the first sentence of Clear is he wished he could swim, and so that just sort of puts him right in the middle of the storm. No preamble, nothing. So yeah, no, I just write a lot, and I sort of liken it a little bit to sort of, it's a bit like flicking paint. You're just kind of, you've got your canvas and you're just sort of flicking scenes and paragraphs and sentences, and at a certain point things begin to cohere here and there.
And a lot of paring away.
And a lot of paring away. Yeah, there's a lot of rubble on the floor. Yeah, sort of, I have to sort of work things out in my head, but then I realize that actually none of that belongs in the story. That it's amazing how much you can do in just one sentence in terms of, some sort of background explanation, or something. You can cover that in a sentence. Or
I will say that it's amazing what you can cover in one sentence. That's what I think is true. Not everybody can do that. I mean, I was thinking you've made concision in the brief novel. You were doing this well before Claire Keegan made it something that publishers actually wanted, right?
Yeah, finally short novels are finally acceptable.
Yes. So let's go to our first the first question. We have 3 questions now. Excellent. So am I able to say who this is from? I'll leave it off. I'll wait for our producers to make sure I can say who this is from. Great discussion. So thank you. Is there a link between language and landscape in Clear? And if yes, can you let us know about the nature of that link?
Well, I mean, absolutely. It's, and is because, I mean, I've never counted them, but, if I had to hazard a guess at the number of words in that Norn dictionary, which have to do with, well, landscape and weather, all those physical things. There are so many. So really the story absolutely grew out of the landscape, and that, this idea that although obviously Ivar, it's not his island, he has no ownership. It's a story about dispossession in so many ways. He is its custodian, and he looks after it, and it looks after him. So it's, and I think that's that's what John begins to see by being there, and begins to understand what a terrible thing it is he's been asked to do. So,
and many of the words in Norn have to do with landscape as well. Sea,
yes,
mud,
yes, they really do. Yes, yeah. So, I mean, I think what's interesting about the book is, even though it's a historical novel, but I couldn't have written it, by any other means. There's no other research, or even by, I mean, I have been there and spent time there, but even my experience is not Ivar's experience, or it's not the experience of a person who needed those words to live and to articulate living that life. So I couldn't have ever created that world through any other means.
Yeah, yeah. And another question, I'm pleased to see one of my MA Creative Writing students putting in a question. Thank you very much, Biz. When was the moment in writing that you decided the ending of the novel was going to have so little conflict or such an easy resolution between all three of the characters meeting after the initial, not quite so unconflicted thing that happens? We're so obviously trying not to give away
well
the ending.
I will say I say I don't think it's easy. I think I'm trying not to give away too much yet, but they're between a rock and a hard place, and somebody has to try and decide what to do. So and I don't see the ending as a resolution. I see it as the beginning of whatever happens after you turn the last page of the novel. I mean, I could say that there are things I hope will happen, and there are things that I fear might happen, but I don't see it as a resolution. I see it as a leap of faith.
Yeah. It's a little bit like, and now I'm blanking on the exact title of Chekhov's story, The Little Dog, the little pet dog, where about the affair. The last sentence is something like, and now when it's really going to start. I'm blanking on what the last sentence is, but it's a bit like that, right? They've made this decision, and now comes the hard part.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I think we have the writer Claire Fuller in the audience who has a couple of questions. Hi, Claire. Thank you for being here. She's wondering what Carys likes to read for pleasure apart from dictionaries. Favorite authors or novels?
Yeah, it's always, well, as Claire will probably know, then it's always, as a writer, you kind of, or I feel, there are things I love to read without having to always be thinking, how are they doing this? How are they doing this? And so I suppose my favorite writers are the ones where I just forget to do that. I'm just sort of blown away. So, I mean, my literary heroines are Penelope Fitzgerald, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty, those sort of writers where there's always quite a lot of comedy, and there is concision, I guess, and just a sort of naturalness. I'm actually at the moment, I'm carting around with me, and I was reading this before she won the Bailey Gifford, but Helen Garner's wonderful diaries, which are so wonderful. And I don't keep a diary. I just seems to be not the way I write about the world through a diary. But hers are absolutely wonderful. They're so full of wisdom and humor and fury, and they're really brilliant. And people are always quite surprised because I write such short books. I also, I love the big enormous 19th century novels too. I know a lot of people hate him, but I love Dickens. I think I just skip past the bad bits because the good bits are so good. So I'm just trying to think of the last book that sort of really blew me away. I think it's the Helen Garner. I'm absolutely just loving those at the moment. And maybe because it's a diary, I'm not sort of thinking too much about how's she doing this, because she's just doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Terrific. Okay. Claire says that I'm currently reading those two and loving them. The diary, I think she means. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Am I back yet?
You are. I lost it also.
That was scary. This never happened before. Hello, everybody. I'm back. I'm not sure what happened, but here we are. Okay, Mia, one of my own students, again, I believe. How much time do you devote to research when writing historical fiction? And does it ever hinder your creative process?
Good question. And I, as I sort of briefly touched on this in our conversation earlier, I don't do very much research. I sort of do it a little bit on the hoof. So with Clear, for instance, I sort of wrote it with what I knew about the Highland clearances, which was very sort of broad brushstroke. I didn't know anything about the Great Disruption in the church, so I did have to sort of do a little bit of research on the way with that. But once I had the story, I did then go back and I did a lot of reading around, and I spent a lot of time in the manuscript and archives at the National Library of Scotland. And probably the most wonderful thing I found there were an envelope of letters which had been written by a Free Church minister, so a minister exactly like John, who'd broken away from the church. Well, actually, they were letters that he was writing to his wife at home in Fife while he was in Edinburgh, rushing around just like John during the when the schism was taking place, and then in the weeks that followed. And he was actually living in digs just down the road from my flat in Edinburgh off Leith Walk, and he almost seemed like John. I mean, it was just really, really extraordinary. And he was really worried about money, and there was a very touching little detail. He was writing to his wife, and by that stage they had to move out of their manse, and she was obviously staying with a friend. And you know how we write care of, if you're writing to somebody in their care of, or then they would just write at. And this minister was saying how much it pained him to have to write her name and then at, so it's just really pained him that they didn't have their own house. So, I am always looking for those little bits of gold in the archive, something, some fantastic primary source. But it was also really useful to, read letters from the ministers on both sides of the divide, the established church and the new church, around the time of the disruption, to get that sort of sense of how they really thought about this, and how much, how socially and intellectually they were sort of closer to the landlords than to the poorer tenants. So I do a lot, but I tend to do it sort of at the back end of things, because I think it does. I think it does weigh you down if you do too much at the outset.
I think I do the same, of just doing it. You do a little bit, and then, Henry James, once somebody was telling him a story, and he said, no, stop there. I don't want to know anything else. That's all I want to know about that story. And research is a bit the same. You can't get overburdened by it. So yeah, you just find those little nuggets.
Yeah. And I mean, now, it is great now. You can, I mean, one small example in the novel, if you haven't read it, Mary has false teeth. And, I did need to do a little bit of research on false teeth in the 1840s, and a little bit on early photography, things like that, and earthquakes, and just to make sure that everything was possible, plausible as I went along. But it's amazing how often it is. It seemed like everything I wanted to happen in the 1840s did happen in the 1840s.
Conveniently.
Yeah.
And then a question from Emily. What is your editing process like?
My ending process.
No, editing.
Oh, editing. It's, I hope, pretty brutal. I mean, I think, there's always this period where you hope something's working, but in your heart, you kind of know it isn't. So you have to get past that, that sort of hoping stage. But no, I love editing. I mean, I love, the really hard and often, sometimes joyous, but also painful bit is that, it's just the getting out of the story. But once that's there, I absolutely love all the sort of the moving around and the drawing out little bits. I mean, sometimes that happens. My first sort of main reader is my agent, and he's very, very good at pushing me, just into some of the corners which maybe I'd been afraid to go into, and asking questions. And so at that point, often a little bit more goes in than had been there initially.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you've written stories and novels. Do you prefer one to the other, and when do you know which is the right form for a story?
I mean, I like doing new stuff. And at the moment, even though this was my third novel, novels still feel quite new to me. I still feel like I'm figuring out what they are. And I only wrote a novel by accident in the first place anyway, because I'd written a long short story called West, which I put aside for a few months. And then when I took it out again and reread it, I just thought, how could I have ever thought this was working as a short story? It doesn't work at all. It's sort of both overburdened and abbreviated. And at that point, I thought, well, let's see, maybe it's a novel. So that's how West came about. And so novels still feel new to me, because I was writing. I love short stories, I do, but I was writing them for 20 years before I wrote a novel. So I think I'm just doing novels at the moment. But never say never. Never say never.
Okay, we have a question from Amanda. I loved this book, a beautiful rendering of an emotive period of our past. Ivar's worldview is starkly different to that of the, quote, improvers. Did you find it an emotional book to write?
Yes, I did. I mean, I love all three of the characters, and they're all in a very tricky spot. And it's amazing how I remember when I wrote my first short story collection, and my publisher said, okay, so what are the stories about? And I said, well, I don't know. You tell me. I just wrote them, and it's amazing how you're not really aware what you're writing. You're telling the story. You're not so much aware what it is about, except gradually I have become obviously increasingly aware that I'm drawn to certain topics that appear to fascinate me. So, things like dispossession and settlement, and, one group of people wanting the land that other people are currently living on, that crops up over again, time and again in my books. So, that did feel, that did feel very emotional. And I did feel, well, I felt for all of them. I felt for Ivar, I felt for John, I felt for Mary. And I really, when I was writing it, I thought for a long time there was going to be a very different ending. An ending which I really didn't, you can't force an ending, but there was a very bleak ending, which I know I really didn't want for the characters. So, yeah, I think you have to be very emotionally involved. I think, to me, in a way, Flannery O'Connor talks about, how if somebody asks you what a story is about, you should just tell them to read the story. And that, it's not so much important what a story is about, it's what its meaning is. And I think for me, meaning is really the emotion that's in the novel. That's what I want people to feel touched by, rather than a sort of more rational sense of, oh, this is a story about possession or whatever. That makes sense.
Yeah. The other emotion that I find really moving in the book is that here Ivar's been by himself for, decades. And then suddenly there's a person in his house who, as he says at point, sees him.
Mm-hmm.
Really sees him. How completely overwhelming that must have been, and kind of fun for you to imagine as well.
Yeah, no, that happens quite early on in the book, and that was a big moment. And it was, I did write quite a lot of this during lockdown and quarantine, and I think those feelings are in the book. I remember, when lockdown was finally lifted, and I remember, being in a room with other people for the first time, and we were also hopeless at being with each other. We didn't know how to be. No, that felt very powerful to me as well, to be, trying to imagine what it would be like to know that you're being looked at for the first time in 20 years.
I think it's only about 6 months ago that all of us got used to going to parties, really. I think that lasted a really long time. Okay, Daphne wants to know what attracted you to this period and place.
I think it was just this. I like the fact that you've used the word attracted, because quite often I'm asked sort of, why did you pick this period? And I said, well, I didn't pick it. It kind of, I got sort of drawn to it. So it was this, because everything was like a sort of confluence of, disappearing and taking away and loss, but also the one thing we haven't talked about actually is the whole, the importance of Presbyterianism and the belief in providence. And I think it's, I think it's in something Muriel Spark says in Miss Jean Brodie. She talks about Presbyterian as being this terrible, terrible joke that we all used to believe in. But that, it seems so unkind, I suppose, that because what the church did, the church instructed the people who were being removed from their property, instructed them that it would be a sin for them to, rebel or protest in any way against what was happening to them, that this was something they had to accept as the will of God, because everything that happens in our lives unfolds according to the will of God. And it seemed a very cruel, just seemed very cruel.
Yeah.
So John is also wrestling with that as well.
Yeah.
Another
thing that strikes me, and this is also related to place, is that, so this novel is set in Scotland, but the Mission House is set in South India, and West is set in the American West. And in Gallon Pike, you have stories in Siberia and Colorado. Just wondering. So are you also attracted to to place as another way of finding a story or setting a story or exploring story?
I think what I'm attracted to are the certain sort of places where the sort of stuff of living kind of has to fall away, so whether it's Ivar's Island or in the Siberian story you referred to as a woman who runs away from Birmingham to Siberia. And there's another short story which is set in the Australian outback, and in sort of utter solitude, almost utter solitude. So it's I was trying to answer one of the earlier questions about the ending. What I'm interested in is I often sort of feel what I'm doing is kind of pushing my characters towards some kind of personal reckoning. And these reckonings, they do often happen in places of great solitude where really they only have themselves to make that reckoning with. And where places where our choices are somehow both very kind of simple and narrow, but also limitless. So what sort of choice will we make? I think that's what I'm always interested in.
And those personal reckonings, and in this book too, often feel they're ethical decisions. And I actually love books that grapple with ethical decisions. I think George Saunders does that really well. I think Gish-Jen does that. Is that something you're aware of exploring? Because you can take these personal decisions and
I've become aware of it. I mean, again, because I don't sort of plot and plan, but I'm always, I always wonder what sort of person would I have been during one of the world wars? Would I have been a collaborator, or would I have been, tremendously brave, or would I have done everything to keep my children safe? And I just don't know. And so I suppose I like putting my characters in those sorts of positions where they have to decide.
Yeah. So one last question, and that is, if you're able to, here you are in Paris for a year at this wonderful fellowship. Can you talk at all about what you're working on? Even if it's just a little hint of tiny little research you did yesterday or something, because I know you won't want to talk about if it's a new novel about the novel.
No, I really don't, because I always have this horrible feeling that the whole thing will just as they say in France, partir en fumée. It will just go up in smoke. It has well, it has a mother in it. How about that? Is that enough?
That's a big character always.
Yeah. Well, no, actually, I haven't really had a mother before as a sort of main character. So
yes,
yeah.
so often miss in West. She's missing, isn't she?
She's not there. Exactly.
Yeah. And Ivar's,
and actually she's sort of there are offstage mothers in the Mission House, and I don't think mothers come into it at all in Clear, actually.
Does Ivar have a grandmother? I feel like he talks about a grandmother. Anyways.
Ivar's mother and grandmother. They've all, the mothers always, they were either dead or they've left.
Well, very, very intriguing.
One hasn't yet. She's still there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Carys, for joining us tonight. This has been amazingly interesting and exciting, and thank you to all of our audience members. I'm looking around for this, so I want to make sure to say. So thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight. And I'd like a virtual round of applause for Carys. I'll make a little applause myself, and we can imagine the roar of the crowd from the audience. This interview, just so all of you know, as well as some of our previous interviews from Writers in Conversation, are on our YouTube channel, and I believe Sylvia, the wonderful Sylvia, has put that in the chat at some point, a link to that. And for anybody near Southampton, we do know which guests we're going to be having next semester, and I'm really excited about them. The one will be Kinnan Jones, whose new story collection, Pulse, has just come out from Granta this very week. So I'm very excited about him coming to join us. And Philip Hoare, the prize-winning nonfiction writer, whose most recent book is William Blake and the Sea Monsters of Love. Anyone who knows Philip's work know the sea always ends up sneaking in there. He's going to be one of our guests. And then the last one is Robin Firth, who is the co-author of the Stephen King Dark Tower comic book series and an author herself. So if you look on our website or on our Facebook page, when I have dates confirmed for sure, they'll be going up. So join us. And Carys, thank you once more. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night. No star.